from beautiful East Tennessee. My name is David Waldrop, and I'm from the local church of Lenore City. And it's my pleasure to bring to you the teaching today from Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35, the road to Emmaus. Such an amazing passage of Scripture. And I'm sure that you should have gone through this with your group or individually and read the chapter already and know it very well and the occurrences. I just want to cover a few special topics out of the reading that will help you in your application and helping you in your understanding of the Scripture from the cultural viewpoint of that day. Starts off by mentioning two of them were traveling. And the two, we know from verse 18 that one of them was Cleopas, really unsure who that might be, except that there was a Clopas, his wife who was also the sister of Mary, the mother of Joseph, was there at the crucifixion. So perhaps it was her husband Clopas, who was traveling back to Emmaus, or actually through Emmaus, and but we're unsure. And the other one is totally unnamed, so we don't know who that was either for sure. But anyway, they were apparently disciples or followers of Jesus that knew him and knew of him, and had some concerns about what had happened to him when he was crucified and what had happened subsequently to him. And they were on their way to Emmaus. Again, Emmaus is not really clear what town this might be. And it mentions a 7-mile trip. And so that really makes it uncertain, because the city that might be Emmaus, that's about 7 miles away, is not really found to be present in the day of Jesus. At least currently, there's no archaeological evidence of that. In the Greek, of course, it says it doesn't use miles, it uses stadia, which is about 60 stadia, and that's what is used in the original. It says 60 stadia, and there's some manuscripts that show that it might have been 160 stadia instead of 60. 160 stadia would have been 18 or so miles, and there is a city there that potentially could be the Emmaus. But the problem we run into with that is that they made a trip back from Emmaus to Jerusalem that very day. So that would have been a 36, 37-mile round trip, which would be pretty, even in that day, of good walking, especially after a leisurely meal together with Jesus, would have been not really been a very practical thing to have happened. One other possible city is a city that's about 3.5 miles away from Jerusalem, and the round trip would have been essentially 7 miles or 60 stadia. And there are some scholars that think that might have been. But again, all of these are speculation and just interesting things to look at, but not a real impact on what Luke is trying to say in this chapter. When we get down to verses 14 and 15, there's three words that are used about what the disciples were doing on their travel back to Emmaus. They were talking. And there's several different versions out there that will use different words. But two of those words are really directly speaking of talking. And in verse 15, it says they were talking and discussing. And discussing brings with it a meaning of they were using logic. They were really trying to dig deep into what was the meaning of Jesus' death, especially since they, as we will see in a few minutes, they were expecting a king, somebody to come to and redeem Israel, and his death kind of, in their mind, throws water on that thinking. And so currently they still did not believe that Jesus had been risen from the dead. And As they were talking, Jesus came up alongside them. And it says their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And so their eyes were covered by the Holy Spirit, by God. Anyway, they were not able to recognize who Jesus was. Kind of reminds us of the song, Open Your Eyes, that open my eyes that I may see. And so they needed to have their eyes open in order to recognize Jesus. And we'll find later that that does happen. But at this point, their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. Also, he was in somewhat of a different form, but there's nothing that says that he didn't still look like Jesus. So let's go with that. That their eyes were prevented. And then Jesus said to them some pretty fantastic words. I think, what are these words that you are exchanging with one another as you are walking? And again, he's kind of words exchanging, some discussing. What are you trying to figure out? What are you talking about as you're walking? This is a classic Jesus question, isn't it? Jesus comes up acting like he doesn't know the answer to the question that he's asking. And he does this quite often in his interactions with the early church leaders that during his ministry, when they would come up to him, he would often act like he didn't know what they were talking about or didn't know the answer to his question, and he wanted to know what it was. And so, a classic Jesus question: what are these words that you're exchanging? And Cleopas answered Jesus, right? And he said, "Are you the only one that doesn't know what happened in Jerusalem?" What I want to bring out that this shows us is that the crucifixion of Jesus, the burial of Jesus, was very widely spread, very well known. These men attested to the fact that everybody knows what happened in Jerusalem. How can you not know? Sometimes you will read other accounts that are skeptical of Jesus' resurrection and his death, and they will play down the fact that this was just a common event in Jerusalem. Yes, crucifixion was common, but they will all go further and say that, nobody really knew about this except for a few followers that would have been there to see Jesus, just like local family and friends that mourned his death. But that's far from the truth based on what these men were saying, that it was very widespread, very well known. And then Jesus said, "What things are you talking about?" And they answered that said the things that Jesus and Nazarene, and notice what they call him, a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people. So here, the men on the road to Emmaus were at the stage of recognizing Jesus as a prophet. Note that they didn't know that he'd risen. They didn't even know about all the events that had happened prior to this thing, such as perhaps, as we see later, a reference to Simon understanding that Jesus had risen. And but anyway, they were at the stage of recognizing Jesus as a prophet. But in verse 21, he goes further and says that he was going to redeem Israel. That's what they were hoping for. They were hoping for more than a prophet. They were hoping for a king, someone who would come and redeem and save Israel, which was the common belief among the Jewish rabbis of that day, that when Jesus came back, he was coming as a king. He was coming to throw out the oppressive Roman rule that surrounded them, and Jesus would redeem them. So here we see first Jesus referred to as a prophet, and then they were expecting a king in verse 21. Then they talk a little about how that the women had been, these disciples did know that the women had gone to the tomb early in the morning. They knew that they had actually come back with the report of hearing about Jesus and that he was alive. That was the women's declaration to the disciples after they came back from the tomb, that he was alive. And then some of those that were others that were present, of the disciples, as we find in some of the other stories, uh, they went back and they found the tomb just like the women described, but they did not see him. And we see in some other accounts that the disciples still did not believe that he had been resurrected, which is kind of astounding since the women attested to the belief of Jesus that was alive, to that belief. And the disciples come back and they still did not believe. Again, I don't want to throw too much on this, but we do find that they didn't believe the women's account of what they had found out, and they still were extremely skeptical about the whole thing. Understandable. They didn't. No one had ever. This had never happened to anyone else before in history. They didn't. It would be kind of unbelievable that Jesus had come alive. But we see these back and forth, believing, not believing, attesting that he was alive, not believing that attestation, and on we go. And then Jesus said, "O foolish men, slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken." So Jesus said, "Why are you still slow to believe?" They still didn't know this was Jesus, but he asked this question. Then he asks another question, and I'm going to read this, but I want you to pause the tape for just a moment. And after I ask this, and if you're in a group setting, talk about why do you think what this question, to think about this. And if you're alone, think about it, write down a couple of thoughts. But Jesus said, was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and enter into his glory? So the question I want you to talk about as you pause this tape is, why was it necessary to suffer? Why was it necessary to suffer? We'll pause for just a few seconds. Okay, you're coming back after discussing this question. I don't know what you said. I know that I got many different answers in the group that I was leading, and all of them are true. But I wanted to share just 3 quick things that I think come out of this question that would be important for us to consider. First of all, it was necessary for him to suffer. In other words, we're not talking about his raising from the dead, but to suffer to fulfill prophecy. And I'll share one verse out of the New Testament, and I'm using all New Testament references in this because I want you to show you that this is how Paul and other writers and Luke came forward in their thinking. First, it was necessary to fulfill prophecy. In Acts 3:18, it says, "But the things which God announced beforehand by the mouth of the prophets, that this Christ should suffer, he has thus fulfilled." So it was necessary for him to suffer to fulfill prophecy. Second, we see that it was necessary for the perfection of Christ. Hebrews 2:10, "For it was fitting for him, for whom all things, and through who are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation, Jesus Christ, through sufferings." So Jesus had to suffer in order to be perfected. It's a hard concept to understand. How can Jesus be perfected? He's already God. But the fulfillment, the completion of his mission, for that to happen, he had to suffer, is what this verse is saying. So first, he had to fulfill prophecy. Second, his perfection was revealed. And thirdly, we see for our perfection, for your perfection, for my perfection, for our completion. James 1:2-4. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance, in other words, the testing, the suffering, the proving of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect work, its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So our suffering, Jesus had to suffer as an example for the suffering we would have to experience if we were to fulfill God's mission in our lives to perfection. So we shouldn't be surprised, and you may talk more about this at the completion of the teaching, but I think those are three reasons why Jesus asked this question. He had to fulfill prophecy, he had to perfect himself in his mission, and it was for our perfection and completion of our mission that suffering was required. And so after he asked this question, he began with Moses and all the prophets, basically used the whole Old Testament to prove his need to suffer and his need to die, and ultimately the resurrection. And so they approached the village, and then Jesus acted like he was going to go on. And they said, come, stay with us. You can stay the night with us. And he agreed. This is a very norm in the Israeli life. They were very hospitable people. They would not allow a stranger to suffer hardship because of them. And so they very willingly accepted Jesus in their home. And from there, we have them. They sat at the table. They reclined at the table to eat the bread and bless it and breaking it, and they handed it out, the food, much like had to be some remembrance of the Lord's Supper, though there's nothing indicating that these two disciples had been there, but maybe they heard about it, or maybe they did witness that. But Jesus often dined with people, and things happened during that time. But here we find their eyes were opened and he vanished. Their eyes, again, like we talked about earlier, their eyes were covered. Their eyes were opened and they saw Jesus for who he was, that he was Jesus. They recognized that Jesus was alive. And just as quickly as that happened, he vanished. And then they talked about how their hearts were burning as they talked. Wow, this is Jesus. Weren't our hearts burning as he spoke all these other words? I'm sure they had to wonder about his great learnedness about the Bible. He was so eloquent as he spoke to them earlier that they had to wonder, how could this person know so much and be so eloquent about the scriptures to us? He must be some sort of a rabbi. But here they recognize, as they arose and they left back to Jerusalem, and they came to the disciples and they said, the Lord has really risen. So let's notice here another word used for Jesus. At first they had talked about him being a prophet and they were looking for a redeemer or a king. And here we see a recognition that Jesus is Lord. Their eyes were fully open to who Jesus was and what that implication meant in their life as they called him their Lord. And it also mentions here in this verse, appearance to Simon. This is probably referring back to Peter. There's a lot of questions about all of this, and we find a lot of things being talked about. I'm reminded of, major events in the world life even today, where there's all kinds of things when you first hear about a death, or a crime or a criminal, and we just, at the time of this recording, just a few days was when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, and so many things we heard, and it became very confusing. And so a lot of the testament about a lot of this stuff comes from different points of view and different ways of looking at things that people saw. So again, I think it's most likely referring to Peter. It could be referring to somebody else, some writers might say. Again, I don't think it's important to what Luke's message. But they related to the disciples all that he had heard, they had seen on the road, and yet they still had a problem believing. And next week we'll see that that problem was alleviated by Jesus's appearance to the disciples in the room. I want to close by just sharing with you a kind of a summary of Luke. I know we have one more week, but I think this is an excellent time to just take a quick look. Luke was written to introduce Jesus to the Gentiles. And they wanted him to know that this is a God worth following. And so from the very beginning, as he appeared to Gabriel and Zechariah, Gabriel appeared to Zechariah and Mary, and foretold Jesus' coming. And then Simeon and Anna had their visions confirmed about all that they had read in scriptures, that the Messiah would be born. They recognized Jesus at that early age, that he was the Messiah, and that was a fulfillment of prophecy. And then we go to that was the beginning of Luke, and then at the end of Luke, in Luke 24, we see some things here. Jesus attesting to all the scriptures and how they were fulfilled in him, though they didn't know it was him at the time. But he opens our minds to his sufferings, death, and resurrection. And so from beginning to end and through it, there's a bunch of places in the middle. Luke is faithful to attest to Jesus' coming in throughout his things, and the Old Testament prophecies that were said about Jesus occurred. So as you continue to do your discussion on this, I know that this is so full of so many applications in our lives, and I know God will speak to you. So have a good time discussing this, and I appreciate the time to be able to share with you this morning here in beautiful East Tennessee. God bless you.